This morning I have the opportunity to share with you some of those thoughts about God as our rock that I was unable to use at that time. Now, this is certainly not an inclusive list, but this morning we're going to focus on three aspects of God as our rock. He provides comfort and encouragement when we feel forsaken. He gives us victory over the enemy, and He is a sure foundation amidst the storms of life. God provides comfort and encouragement when we feel forsaken. We need to rest in the rock. Turn to Jeremiah 31:13. Jeremiah 31:13, and hold your finger there. The first story in the Bible where a rock has a supporting role is found in Genesis 28. And we're all familiar with the story. Jacob has deceived his father and has stolen the birthright from his brother Esau. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but now he's having to flee from the wrath of Esau, his brother. You would have thought he could have foreseen that. He feels forsaken, alone, and lost. He is overcome with guilt for his deception. He's a fugitive going to a strange land where he knows no one. Just getting there is going to be hazardous, for he will have to pass through hundreds of miles of land filled with hostile tribes and wild animals. He will probably never see his beloved family again. He's alone, forsaken, and lost. It's in this state of mind that he lies down to sleep the second night, and he finds a stone to use as a pillow, probably after patting it first with his robe and his Adidas backpack. Later we'll see that he sets the same rock up as a pillar, as a memorial to this occasion. So maybe it wasn't just a pillow, but maybe it was long enough that he could totally lie on it. And so therefore he'd be a little bit elevated from the morning dew when it's about to come, and from snakes and other critters. But whatever, he lies down on his mineral futon. He has a dream that night. He sees a ladder reaching from earth to heaven. Angels are going up and down this ladder, mediating between God and man. Thank you. I saw about 3 or 4 people get up and do that. Thank you. In his dream, God speaks to him. And though Jacob feels totally alone and forsaken, God says, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. So Jacob realizes that he is not alone and forsaken. God is with him and promises never to leave him. He rested on the rock when he felt forsaken, and he rests on these promises of God's word, and so can we. The next morning, Jacob sets up this rock as a pillar and anoints it with oil. He sets the place aside, he sanctifies it, and makes a vow to God, to be faithful to God, to worship God only. He calls this place Bethel, which means house of God. Now, little sidebar linguistic lesson here. Beth means house of, and El, you recognize that as some of the names of God. El Shaddai, Elohim, and on the cross Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, my God, my God. So Beth, house of, El, God. Other examples of Beth being house of: Bethlehem meant house of bread. Beth plus Lechem. Bethany, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, house of the poor. Bethsaida, which was a town on the shores of Galilee, where the fishermen lived, some of Jesus' disciples. That meant house of fishing, appropriate. And finally, Bethesda, where the pool of Bethesda was. Remember the man who was healed at the pool of Bethesda? Bethesda, Bethesda. Bethesda means house of olives and not house of SDAs. So Jacob sets up this pillar monument and calls it Bethel, the house of God. because he says, surely the Lord was in this place and I did not know it. Sometimes the Lord is closer than we know, and we don't know it. We don't look, we don't see. This rock becomes a symbol of the time when God appeared to him in a dream and promised to be with him and to return to him someday to this land. Now fast forward 20 years. As God has promised, he has been with Jacob, and Jacob has become very wealthy and prosperous and successful in this foreign land. He has accumulated a large family and servants and flocks and herds and cattle numbering into the thousands and riches. He's so successful that his brothers-in-law begin to plot against him. So God speaks to him again in a dream, and he reminds him, he says, I am the God of Bethel. In other words, remember that experience. I'm the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. First, Jacob had to flee from his brother Esau and from his home. Now he has to flee from his brothers-in-law and flee back to his home and Esau's wrath. So he starts home with his vast family and servants and herds. As he nears Bethel, this holy, sanctified place, this house of God, he calls his entourage together. And he tells them the story of his first visit there and how it came that he established this memorial. As he reviewed the wonderful blessings of God with him and his family, they're moved. And when he calls on them to put away the strange gods that they have amongst them so that he may fulfill his vow of worshiping the true Yahweh God, they gladly comply. At this rock memorial, Jacob renews his vow to God and is once again comforted, encouraged to know that he is about to face Esau's wrath, but he still has God with him. He still is not alone and forsaken. And he renews his allegiance to God as he moves forward. In this story, we see that Jacob rested on the rock when he felt forsaken, and so can we. God gave him words of encouragement and comfort and promise never to leave him. And we have those same assurances. But how do we rest on the rock? He was resting on a literal rock. But how can we rest on the rock? By going to his word and looking at his actions toward man and claiming the same God that we see in the Bible as our God. Those same words of comfort and encouragement and promises given to Jacob are for us. When we rest on the rock, it is also how we remember how God has led us in the past so that we can continue to know his peace and presence. Jeremiah 31:13, if you still have your fingers there, it says, Then shall the virgin rejoice in singing, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning, mourning, I will turn their mourning to joy and comfort them. Even my paper's nervous, it's sticking together. I will and comfort them, and they will rejoice rather than sorrow. God provides comfort and encouragement. Rest in the rock. God gives us victory over the enemy. Turn to Psalms 18, verses 46 to 48. Psalms 18, 46 to 48. Now we all know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath has been taunting and harassing the armies of Israel. Besides his intimidation warfare, he's also just plain humongous. So when he challenged the Israelites to a one-on-one battle, no one accepted. That is, no one until little David came along. With his childlike faith, he questioned why Israel would allow this uncircumcised heathen to triumph over them when they had all the power of God at their disposal. This angered the soldiers, and especially David's older brothers. They accused him of being proud and arrogant, implying that they are cowards when they do not confront Goliath. But David puts his faith into action. He doesn't just talk, he walks the talk. He takes a stone out of his fanny pack and slings it toward Goliath. The God-directed stone strikes the Philistine on his forehead, and he falls flat on his face. Wouldn't you like to see your enemies and your problems fall flat on their faces? 1 Samuel 17 says, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, but there was no sword in the hand of David." Now, though this is a real historic story, and we can get lessons from it, we can also make a parable out of it. Goliath represents the devil, taunting us and tempting us to sin. Without God, we are no match for Satan's temptations. But Christ, the rock, the stone that the builders rejected, he brings victory over the enemy. He brings the enemy down. He falls flat on his face, just as David brought down Goliath. Notice the text says, there was no sword in the hand of David. The victory is through faith alone, and nothing of our doing, none of the implements of man's making. The David and Goliath story tells us that the Rock of Ages gives us victory. Victory when all seems lost. Victory that comes from not our efforts, but from God when we are in a faith relationship with Him. Psalms 18, 46 to 48, if you still have that. It says, "The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. Let the God of my salvation be exalted. It is God who avenges me and subdues the peoples around me. He delivers me from my enemies. You also lift me up above those who rise up against me. You have delivered me from the violent man." God promises to deliver us from the violent men in our lives, from our problems, from our enemies. But we need to learn to trust in the rock. A third aspect of God as the rock is that He's a sure foundation amidst the storms of life. We need to reside in the rock. Turn to Psalms 27:5. Psalms 27:5. This is another familiar story that you all know. It's where God is represented as the rock. I'm sure we all remember singing, and it's the wise man and the foolish man who built their house on the rock and on the sand. So we all are familiar with that. And we also, I'm sure, remember singing it in kindergarten about the wise man building his house on the rock and the foolish man building his house on the sand. It was always a favorite of ours in kindergarten. And when we got to the line and the house on the sand went crash, the girls would clap their hands to emphasize clash, but not the little boys. To emphasize crash, they would throw themselves on the floor like overturned turtles and flail their arms and legs in the air until some teacher would come along and pick them up. We thought they were just kind of being boys. Now, of course, someone would put them on Ritalin and say they have ASDH. I used to think that the foolish man wasn't just foolish, he was stupid. He was IQ of a houseplant stupid. Hadn't this foolish man ever played in the sand at the beach and tried to dig a hole in the sand? The sides cave in faster than you can scoop out the collapsing sand. And lest you think it is just the water filling up the hole that makes it collapse, it's not any easier to dig a hole in the sand in the desert where there is no water. The dry grains of sand keep falling into this hole. You certainly wouldn't want to try to build a structure on this shifting sand. So as I say, I thought he's not foolish, he's stupid. Well, then I took an evening lecture. I went to an evening lecture at the Waikiki Aquarium entitled Sand. Now I know you're thinking, really, Judy? A lecture at the aquarium on sand? Get a life. But stick with me here. During this lecture, we did some hands-on things. We looked at grains of sand from around the world under a microscope. Do you know that some actually look like little snowflakes? The instructor, sand was her hobby and her passion, and so as people knew this, especially the military, whenever they went somewhere, they'd send her back all these samples. So she had probably about 20 microscopes set up where we could look at samples of sand. Sometimes it doesn't take much to excite me. We also did experiments on the sand to try to differentiate between sand that comes from a continent and sand that comes from an island. Now, I wasn't going to describe this, but you folks gave me so much time today. The pastor would envy this time, but anyway. So she gave us 2 samples, A and B. We were sitting at tables, and about 4 people at a table, and we were supposed to tell which one came from a continent and which one came from an island. And she had us she had little cups like soy sauce comes in, show you, and she had us put a few drops on each of the sand samples. Now, when you put it on the sand from a continent, you just get this little pile of wet sand. But when you put it on sand from an island, you get little bubbles coming up, like in your soda, which is the carbon dioxide being given off. The difference being that the sand from a continent is made from rocks that have, like Rocky Mountains, and that have rolled down and in streams and whatever, have gotten to the ocean, have gotten taken out, gotten back in, and they're all pulverized into sand. Just plain old mineral rock. So you put vinegar on it and you have wet sand. However, sand from an island also has a lot of pulverized, broken up coral and shells and those kinds of things that were once living. And of course, if you remember your organic chemistry, everything living has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. And anyway, so the acetic vinegar works its little reaction and you get carbon dioxide coming off the sand. So, it was very exciting. And we all correctly identify sample A is whatever it was, the continent, and sample B is from an island. Okay, so now you're saying, so what does that have to do with the wise and the foolish builders? I'm getting there. Just this, maybe the foolish man wasn't so much foolish and stupid as he was lazy and negligent. Maybe he had originally built his house on the rock, but then he hadn't kept up with the maintenance on the foundation. So when the winds and rains, the waves and storms came, the solid rock that he had wisely built upon became pulverized sand, and he didn't even know it. Till finally one day the big storm comes and his house crashes. Unbeknownst to him, the rock he originally built on is now sand. Job expresses the same concept in Job 14, verses 18 to 20. He says, "But as a mountain erodes and crumbles, and as rock is moved from its place, the water wears away stones and torrents wash away soil, so you destroy man's hope. You overcome him once for all, and he is gone." Now, Job was making a different point here. I won't quite digress that far, but he obviously understood the point that rock is not necessarily stable forever. I'm sure that we all at some time decided to follow God. Perhaps it was an altar call at an evangelistic meeting, or the culmination of a series of one-on-one Bible studies. Or if you're raised in a Christian home, maybe it was the gentle prodding from your families, your parents, your teachers, or maybe the peer pressure of your friends. Whatever it was, we all decided at some point to build our houses or our lives on the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. But it's not enough just to make that decision once, one time, and think that we are forever established on the rock. Of course, Christ as the rock is stable and secure. But there's Satan out there, and he's wanting to erode our foundations. So with his temptations and distractions, he's trying to eat away at the foundation that we have chosen, to erode away the rock and pulverize it into sand. We have to be diligent in maintaining our foundation. And how do we do that? The same way we came to God is the way we stay with God. Bible study, prayer, association with like believers so we can build each other up. Your house on the rock of Jesus Christ So maybe, So maybe the moral of the parable of the wise and the foolish man is not so much build your house on the rock of Jesus, but maintain your foundation on the rock of Jesus Christ, the Word. Psalms 27:5 says, For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. He shall set me high on a rock. God is a firm, sure foundation amidst the storm of life. Reside in the rock. Now, I said we're going to look at three aspects of the Christ as the rock, but we're going for four. God supplies our physical needs. We need to rely on the rock. Turn to Psalms 81:18. While the children of Israel were journeying into the promised land for 40 years, God, the rock of ages, provided all their physical needs, especially food and water. We're all acquainted with the story in Exodus 17, where God provided water from a hard rock. When the people were complaining about not having water, God instructed Moses to go to a rock near Mount Sinai and to strike the rock. Water would flow out. While Israel was encamped at Mount Sinai for about a year, building the tabernacle and learning more about the God that they have forgotten during 400 years of slavery, the water from this rock was their water supply. Paul makes an interesting comment in 1 Corinthians 10:3 and 4, in referring to the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness. He says, They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Again, it wasn't just a one-time experience, but a continuing relying on the same rock which had originally provided them with water. Now, I'm not sure what Paul means when he said the rock accompanied them. Perhaps they actually carried the rock with them. Remember, they're already carrying the ark with which was already heavy and overlaid with gold, and had the gold angels on top of it, had the tables of stone in it. So they're already transporting heavy things, and that was on the shoulders of the priests. So what's one more heavy burden of a boulder, especially when it's not a burden, when it's your water supply? So maybe they actually took this boulder, this rock, and put it on a cart and carried it with them for their water supply. Or perhaps, when Paul says the spiritual rock accompanied them, perhaps again it was a metaphor for having the presence of Jesus the rock with them for a constant water supply, whether from a constantly flowing river or from an oasis from time to time or for other rocks. We don't know the exact mechanism. Maybe when Moses struck the rock, a river came out. Remember, there's over between 1 million and 2 million people. So maybe this river kind of divided, the subdivided, went all around and through the camp. And maybe each time that they started the next section of their journey, this river went with them and they followed the river. Maybe it was drying up behind them, but it was always, we don't know the exact mechanism. But we do know that they relied on Christ the rock for their water. Now, water is essential for physical life. I'm sure that you've all heard statistics such as you can only live 3 or 4 days without water. And many of us have our water here today. Me too. Here's some interesting statistics. Well, I found them interesting, but then I found a lecture on sand interesting. So, if you lose, your body is 2/3 water. If you lose 2% of your body water, not your body weight, but your body water, if you lose 2% of your body water, your energy will be decreased by 20%. So when you get tired, maybe you just need to take a few swigs of, or many swigs of water. A 10% decrease of the water in your body will cause you to be unable to walk. And a 20% decrease in the water in your body through dehydration leads to death. So in our physical bodies, a relatively small decrease in the water can have much larger consequences in our health. So what about our spiritual life? Psalms 41, 1 and 2 says, "As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God." If this thirst is not quenched, we can suffer from spiritual dehydration. Just as losing 2% of your body water causes your energy level to be decreased by 20%, a small decrease in quenching your spiritual thirst, it might manifest itself in a loss of energy for spiritual activities. If just a 10% decrease in the water in your body will cause you to be unable to walk, further spiritual dehydration leads to impairment in our walk with God. And just as 20% decrease in the water in your body leads to death, so spiritual dehydration eventually leads to spiritual death. Psalms 81:16 says, "He would have fed them also with the finest of wheat, and with honey from the rock I would have satisfied you." God supplies our needs. We need to rely on the rock. So there you have it. 4 aspects of Christ as our rock. He supplies our needs, the need for comfort and encouragement, the need for victory over our enemies, and the need for a sure foundation during the storm, and the bonus one, and the need for our physical sustenance. He invites us to rest on the rock, as Jacob did, to trust in the rock, as David did, and to reside in the rock, as did the wise man in building his home on the rock, and also to rely on the rock, as did the children of Israel during their 40 years of wandering. So we need to rest, trust, rely, and reside.